Hi, folks. Welcome to Sorting Myself Out. And today I'll be speaking with Dr. Clifford Mays. Dr. Mays is an educational psychologist and a Jungian scholar. He founded Archetypal Pedagogy and is also a prolific writer, having written 12 books and many serious academic articles and essays. Dr. Mays is a treasure trove of knowledge and wisdom. I found him to be incredibly lucid in his speaking and his sharing. He is just an encyclopedia of knowledge, both in Jungian psychology, Freudian psychology, the history of education, philosophy. Dr. Mays is a highly respected scholar and an important force in the world and in the field of psychology. We can all learn a lot from Dr. Mays' teaching. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Clifford Mays. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to sharing you with the listeners. I think that you have a gift for teaching and for writing, and I think that
Well,
it's just a
thanks.
blessing to be able to share that with the world. So, why don't you
Well,
start by
it
go ahead?
sure was a blessing having you as a student. I've got to say, one of the high points in my 36-year career. That's
Oh,
not
that's sweet.
just because we're on tape right now. That's a fact. So thanks, Ryan.
Wow, that's really sweet of you to say. So, take us through your journey a little bit. I know you were born in the 50s near an Indian reservation, and all sorts of things were going on at that point. So, I'd love to hear about how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, sure. I'll try to make it short and sweet, like me, as a matter of fact, at my now present 5'6", having lost a centimeter or something every year. Now I'm 66. Well, I was born in 1953, in the beginning of the Eisenhower years in Tucson, Arizona, which at that time was a sleepy little southwestern town of 30,000, and we lived on the outskirts, uh, right next to the what was called then the Papago Nation. They're now known as I believe it's pronounced Tono Odam, and that was a mile to the west of me, and a mile to the south of me was, well, more than that, about 10 miles, was the Yaqui Indian Reservation. I went to a junior high school and a high school in Tucson that were about 30% African American, 30% Latino American, although that was mostly Mexican American, and the name then was Chicanos, and about 30% Caucasian. That was me, even though I was born Jewish. I suppose I fit into that category in that population, and about 10% Native American. I've gone on and done a few things in my academic career, Ryan, but I think the thing I'm most proud of is that I was class president and all through junior high school and high school, this white guy. And that was a privilege. And it really spoke to my early experience, which was intensely multicultural. Jumping ahead a bit, I'll say that I then went on to teach at universities in Central America and in Japan for most of the 80s and into the early 90s. So I've certainly had some multicultural seasoning in my day. Um, Certainly lived through all of the 1960s stuff. Even though I was born in '53, I was a college freshman at 15, so I was on campus in '68, which was the epiphanic year politically
You were
on
a college
campuses.
freshman at 15?
Yeah, I was.
Wow.
I tell you, as an educational psychologist, I'll say now that I think that's a form of child abuse. And I'll talk more about that later as we talk about my views in educational psychology.
Okay.
It certainly is a way of communicating the message to the child that he's lovable because of how he performs. And the flip side of that, as Jung would say, the shadow side of that is that you're not lovable if you don't. And so it's an immense amount of pressure, really. And as I say, as an educational psychologist now, I consider it a form of child abuse. Alan
Mhm.
Block, who wrote a book called "I'm Only Bleeding," from a Bob Dylan song, and the subtitle is "Education is the Practice of Social Violence Against Children," and he really hit it on the head the nail on the head with that title. And really accelerating a child or really holding a child back send insidious and invidious messages to kids. And they become not subjects in their full subjectivity and selfness. They become objects. I think one of the cruelest things I see when I go cruising around throughout the day is the bumper sticker, "My child is an honor student at such and such a school." Uh, it seems to me that after the first flush of excitement that the child might feel, at some level, she or he is going to register the message that they're an object, just like the car, and their accomplishments are pasted all over the car. They're both objects. They're narcissistic objects for the parents. Whether or not the child is an honor student should be irrelevant. Whether or not the child is coming into its own fully at all of the different levels of experience and analysis that I think we'll talk about here today. That's what matters. But we live in a corporatized, objectified society. I mean, Marx, who got a lot wrong, although in the 60s on the far left, that was my, the Das Kapital was my Bible. I think he did get right the idea that in a capitalist society, everything is ultimately commodified. He called it commodity fetishism. And the thing that ultimately becomes a thing that shouldn't be a thing is the individual. The individual becomes the ultimate commodity. And the commodification of children in the schools is something that I'm constantly ranting and raving about. So now you remember my lectures, Ryan. They're spaghetti casseroles. They go from here to there and here to there and all over. And let's get back to the question that you asked me.
Well, that's what I actually like about it.
Thank you.
It's an adventure, and it takes you through different nooks and crannies and allows you to really sink in with whatever the depth and the width of the subject is. So.
Well, thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that. And I think that the curriculum is a living thing. Student and teacher, student and student, teachers and teachers should be relating to each other on what the Jewish ethicist Martin Buber called an I-thou basis. You're my dialogical partner. I want to learn from you, and I think I may have some things to tell you, and I'm ready to stand corrected, and I hope you are too. It's what Sir Karl Popper called falsifiability. We believe what we believe, but we also know that it's falsifiable. That's an I-thou relationship, and Buber makes it the centerpiece of his ethics. In commodifying students, in commodifying the curriculum, that is to say, in standardizing it, and in making it a political football, the great American pastime next to actual football, people get commodified. And the tragedy here is that these are very young people, and their lives as educational beings is thereby commodified. I've done thousands of hours of pastoral counseling with people. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology in addition to one in education, and I've done a lot of pastoral counseling in that capacity when I was in that context. And I came to the empirical conclusion that one's narrative of oneself as a being who learns and teaches extends far beyond formal school boundaries. And it is, in fact, integrally interwoven with the person's narrative of herself or himself in general, period. So that if a person has a troubled narrative of themselves as a learner, they have a troubled narrative of themselves in general. I found again and again in talk therapy with clients and in the analysis of dreams and the taking apart of symptoms and all kinds of things, that more often than not, salient in those narratives were episodes, incidences, long stretches of time, leitmotifs of their lives as students. So that for me, educational psychology is not just about what happens in school. It's about teaching and learning, which is life. And that's why I'm so
Wow,
passionate about it. And I've written so much about it.
that's so
Um,
powerful.
well, oh, thanks,
Can I
Ryan. I
share
appreciate
something with
that.
you? Because I'd like your opinion as an
Sure,
educational psychologist.
sure.
So, when I was growing up, I had a really hard time in school, and the overwhelming message I got is something's wrong with me.
Right,
The teachers overwhelmingly disliked me because I wasn't very attentive and
right.
I did my own thing. And so, but I got this, and then my parents freaked out, and the whole situation got really tense. So there was this really strong message that whatever I was, it wasn't okay.
That's right.
Can I get your opinion on that as an
You
educational psychologist?
you sure can. And I've been listening to you carefully. I'm trying to find a passage in one of my books where I wrote about that, and I can't find it right off the bat. Um, Let me put it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Educational problems in students, let's take this creature known as ADHD, um, are very often and very largely not something that is inherent in the student, but is an artifact of the system. Put a child in a classroom where he or she is regimented into a standardized curriculum, which has been devised for essentially corporate purposes to fit the child into what the great educational historian Joel Spring calls the sorting machine of education. You go in one end and you come out the other, the obedient worker citizen, as he calls it. There's no soul in that education. It's totally eviscerated. And students act out in those kinds of situations, and rightfully so. They act out in all kinds of ways, from boredom to distraction to violence to defiance to you name it. These behaviors then are identified and officially pathologized. They become illnesses, and the illness is now putatively in the student. The blame is completely exported from the system itself, which is where it really belongs in most cases, to the student. The student, in effect, becomes what we call in therapeutic situations the identified patient. You know, a family shows up and Mary is going nuts and acting out. But when you get right down to it, you realize that what she's acting out is the family's systemic problem. In a sense, she's the one with the courage to act it out, or at least the impulsion to act it out. And so you have to start shifting the blame off of her and looking at what is pathological in the system. What are identified as learning disorders, in my view, are very often the result of the increasing regimentation, corporatization, dehumanization of schooling itself. And children will act out. Boys biochemically, are more predisposed to act out, I think, and you see larger numbers of them diagnosed with it than girls. But the boy-girl divide in responses to public schooling is a historical question that goes back, at least 130 years.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a major aspect of it today. So I know you. I've had you in class. I've read your work. I've heard your statements in class, which I think are extremely eloquent and in some cases really bold and get you into trouble, which endeared you to me immediately, because you actually had opinions that were not the usual route, and you handled it really beautifully. I would say, knowing what I know of you now, if you want to know in respect what my diagnosis was or
Sure,
is,
sure.
I'd say that you were a pretty darn bright little guy who was registering at all kinds of levels that this was violating you emotionally and spiritually, and you then acted out in some way, and you then were pathologized, and for all I know, you were fed chemicals to control it.
Oh,
Lots of
I was
kids
on
are.
I was on 9 different medications,
Right.
none of which are good
Brought
for
to you,
you.
by the way, none of which are good for you. And in my day, we used to call it speed, and we drop a lot of it before we had a big term paper due the next day. Um, Chemicals that are brought to you, by the way, by the same system that created the same schools that created the problem in the first place. So it becomes this self-legitimating cycle in which the student is more or less crucified on a corporate cross. And may I say a word about what I mean by corporate education?
Yes, take it
Or
away.
am I
No, no,
just,
we're just gonna
whoa,
we're gonna follow this thread
oh,
where it goes.
great. Okay. Well, I'll tell you, even though my politics are not to the right necessarily, although on some issues they are, I will say that every professor is like Ronald Reagan. That is insofar as we give ourselves goosebumps when we hear ourselves talk. So if I go on and on about something, you can just say double R as a code phrase, and I'll know what you're talking about. Um, by and, by and far and away, the greatest, the dean of American educational historians is a man named Lawrence Kremen. And his culminating work was a 3-volume tome called American Education: The Colonial Experience, the Republican Experience, and the Metropolitan Experience. The Metropolitan Experience came out in 1988. In that book, to whoever to whomever happens to be listening, if you're interested in the history of American education, I can't think of anything really much more fascinating than Carl Jung. Um, um, I um, I recommend that, and I recommend starting with volume 3. Actually, it's about a 900-page tome, so be prepared. In it, Kremen in 1988 predicted, and he wasn't big into predictions, but that the greatest threat to democracy, he said, it's almost a direct quote, in the 21st century would be the growth of what he called the military industrial educational complex.
Wow.
Of course, he was spinning off on President Eisenhower's last address from the Oval Office. I think it was in January of '61. I may be wrong, just, days, maybe minutes before Kennedy was sworn in, and all of that began. Um, he was spinning off on, obviously, Eisenhower's military industrial complex behemoth. But what Kremen saw was a morphing of American education away from its original purposes to create an egalitarian society, as Dewey said in his book classic, 1916, Democracy and Education, probably the greatest single text that ever has been written on American education, that the title wasn't gratuitous. Democracy needed education, obviously, to have an informed citizenry, but education was, in effect, a democracy in pedagogical form. And what he meant by that was not that in class we study about George Washington and the Louisiana Purchase and the war in Vietnam. We do those things. But what he really meant is that education, the classroom, should be a democracy in miniature, where students and teachers negotiate interesting questions together, and together generate further questions of increasing charm. And truth then becomes a movable feast as the class moves from pedagogical moment or curricular moment to curricular moment, sort of inventing itself as it goes, always under the stewardship of the teacher, but not under the authoritarian hegemony, that's a redundancy, of the teacher. What Kremen saw is that more and more where students were placed, the kinds of tracks they were put in, the amount of the differential funding that went to different schools. I mean, in some public schools and very wealthy districts, students get up to $50,000 a year spent on them. In poorer schools, like where I came from, they have $8,000 a year spent on them, but they take the same tests. And so it becomes a mechanism for deciding what kind of education they will get and to what purposes. And the purposes are more and more corporate. How will this student fit into the new national and global world order? Betraying my conspiracy theorist
Can I ask you a
proclivity.
question about that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm going on and on.
No, no, this is fantastic. I'm just curious. So it seems to me that you're strongly against the systemization that public schools or schools for anyone under the age of 18 or perhaps even college. You're strongly suspicious, or even further than that, you believe strongly that something horribly wrong is going on,
Oh yeah.
and you believe that there's a corporate underpinning that's kind of tying it down, or putting it, directing it in that direction. Is that true? Is that what you're saying? Am I getting
Boy,
that right?
look at our president secretary of education. One of my doctorates is in the history of American education. I can tell you from my point of view, without reservation, she is the lowest moment in the history of the Secretaryship of Education. Her even basic understanding of certain pedagogical and organizational facts about education is atrocious. Her her agenda is clearly to serve, I think, corporate interests that have indirectly put her into office. Intentionality is always a dicey thing, and I won't speak to whether or not there are these cabals that are insidiously working these things out from day to day. However, there is a dynamic, conscious and unconscious, stated and not covert and hidden in plain sight, that have increasingly turned education not into the exploration and the nurturance of the student as a democratic being, engaged in an amazingly idealistic and, by the way, extremely fragile world historical project.
Mhm.
That is pretty much gone. The stuff that I write on, the psychological deepening and nurturance, the psycho-spiritual deepening and nurturance of the child, is virtually a non-issue. The fitting of the child into a system so that, again, to quote Spring, she or he becomes a good worker citizen or cog in the machine. That's where it's at now.
Wow.
And Kremen saw this. Don't take it on my advice. I'm just another professor of education. Kremen was the the Einstein of American educational history, and a fairly conservative fellow, actually. So that he came to this conclusion was noteworthy enough, and it has been breathtaking in how much his prophecy come true.
Yeah, well, and
And so
I
my work is a rage against that. Yeah.
yeah, well, I know a lot more about you personally than a lot of the audience, and one thing that's interesting is that you're not just a guy that just bucks the system for the sake of bucking the system. I mean, you're looking at these things with very close scrutiny, and we've had a lot of conversations about that. And it
Right.
just seems to me that what you're saying about the education system, it's a real problem, and it's scientifically quantifiable. Like you can measure the problem. I mean, your whole argument lays it out quite nicely. And one of the things that pops into my mind is
Thank
that
you.
there's almost nothing done for the development of personality whatsoever in these educational
Nothing.
systems.
Nothing. In fact, I'm writing a book on that right now.
What's the
Um,
book?
the book is, let's see, what have we finally decided on? I think it's Archetype, Culture, and the Individual in Education, the three narratives of teaching and learning. I can break that title down for you later if you like, but
Yeah.
one of my, well, I would say that the central organizing point is that the student as a rich as a rich biographical being, the student, that's one narrative. The student as an individual engaged in a significant world historical project like democracy, that's the second narrative, the second dimension of time. And the student as a spiritual being evolving, those three dimensions of time, those three narratives, which in my view should be core to education, and even public education. There are all kinds of ways of dealing with psychospiritual matters in the schools in a constitutionally and generally legally acceptable way. I wrote an article on that with Scott Farron, one of America's top educational lawyers, that was reviewed by Martin Marty, who's America's top religious historian in the United States, and they concluded that we came up with ways to do this that are constitutionally protected. In any case, back to these three timelines, these three narratives, these three uh, true stories, true fictions, I guess, that we tell ourselves really do make sense of our lives, that are what keep us from falling into despair or desuetude. Those are ignored. They're erased. They're violently attacked in schools now, I think largely because they simply don't fit the mechanistic agenda that increasingly governs schools. And in saying this, I want to emphasize that teachers are my heroes. Between about 1990 and 96 or 97, I think, a lot of my research was on the teacher's sense of calling. And you know, Ryan, most teachers go into teaching because these are profoundly ethical people.
Mm.
They love children. They love their subject matter. They care about whether or not they consciously are aware of these three dimensions of time and narrative. They care about nurturing that in their students and in themselves. And they are my heroes. They fight against all odds to make this happen. How difficult it is clear in the fact that within 5 years of teaching, 50% of teachers have left the profession. That's an extremely high burnout rate. I have a book. Can I put it up? I don't know if it'll even show.
Absolutely.
It's called Reclaiming the Fire, which I wrote with my colleagues, Mark Grandstaff, who was a professor of foreign policy and went on to become a Jungian, and Alexandra Fiddick, a professor at University of Alberta in education, who focuses on the kind of thing I do, archetypal pedagogy,
Mm.
in which we try to help teachers find that sense of calling again. So that's a large problem. So when you look at the high rate of morbidity among children in the schools with regard to ADHD, and you look at the 50% burnout rate among teachers, it takes the worst kind of ostracism, not ostrichism, to not ostracism, but ostracism, to stick your head in the dirt and say, well, the problem is the teachers and the kids. The problem is essentially the increasingly constricting, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually constricting environment that the school has become because of a world historical tendency towards increasing corporatization and rationalization of society. This is nothing new. I mean, Weber and Durkheim talked about it. It's been discussed for the past 180 years, and depending upon how you read Marx, for almost the last 200 years, the increasing what Durkheim called anomie. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I don't do French too well, but anonymity of the individual as she or he becomes more and more lost in the machine. And the school is both an epiphenomenon and a victim of that.
Wow. Earlier you said Marx got some things right, although he got a lot of things wrong. Can you elaborate?
Oh, gee, I don't know if I want to. My conservative friends will disown me. Um,
Why is that?
and Oh, well, I mean, citing Marx favorably in any connection or in any way, I think that um, although he only, and I'm not a great Marx expert, I mean, I've been reading Marx all my life. I wouldn't characterize myself as a Marxian by any means. No, I would have in the 60s. I did in the 60s. Now I'm kind of centrist and kind of go issue by issue with things. On cultural matters, I'm pretty much to the left. I mean, my daughter is gay, and I love that about her. I celebrate that in her, and it's a beautiful thing. She has a fabulous relationship, and they're both beautiful, creative people. On economic matters, which I'm not really competent to speak on, but see if that stops me. I've moved very much in the other direction and sort of tend more in a libertarian uh, uh, towards a more libertarian field,
Sure.
but but again, it all varies with the issue about Marx. Um, well, some things I liked about him. Some things I like about him. I think that Marx was very good at analyzing, and uh, uh, my what is a Greenspanian conservative friends will hate me for saying this, but I think that he understood that a commodity based society, a society that suffers from what he calls commodity fetishism. We're not only the objects we use, but we ourselves become commodities in a market. Creates the three different kinds of alienation, according to Marx. Um, I can give you an example of it from my own life. Oh, wait a second. I just lost the picture.
I'm right here.
Do you still have me, or what did I do?
I still
I
have
will.
you. I still have
Okay.
you.
I don't have you. I don't know what I did.
That's
Maybe
okay.
it's this.
You can just keep going for now as long as you can hear me.
I can, and I'm back online, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I've got
I see me. Okay. I see me.
you.
Um, uh, Let me give you an example of a job I had when I was in college, working my way through it. I came from I lived in the poor side of town. I came from a not well-off family. Um, I worked at a bottle packaging plant, and my job from about 11 at night to 7 in the morning, which is, Ryan, works for me because I never sleep, rarely. Well, 3 or 4 hours a night, but it worked for me. But nevertheless, it got pretty grim about 3 or 4 in the morning. All you're doing is taking plastic bottles and putting them in these compartmentalized boxes, wrapping it up, sending it down the conveyor belt, and everybody else around you is doing the same thing in this drab, green, horrible box of sweaty humanity. And you could find a escape from it all by going to the coffee room, which was even worse. And on it, it had a great big poster with a terrible looking, awesome, awfully awesome, uh, grisly, wizened character. And the poster simply read, "Quit your bitching." Um, well, that environment exemplified for me Marx's three alienations. First, you're definitely alienated from your work. That's a big thing. We are, to a large extent, our work. That's the kind of species being that we are, Marx said. And Freud said that the ultimate goal of analysis was to be able to, quote, to love and to work. When we don't work at something that is beautiful to us, or at least meaningful, I'm in power saving mode. Okay, now I'm not. That would be terrible if the computer just off. Um, when our work is not to some degree an expression of who we are alienated from it. That work sure as hell was not an expression of who I am or who anybody else in that horrible plant at below minimum wages was. When you are alienated from your work, which you're often doing in conjunction with other people, if they are similarly alienated, then you have your second alienation, which is alienation from others. But if you're alienated from your work and you're alienated from others, there's not much left of you to relate to or to relate with. And so ultimately, you're alienated from yourself.
Mm.
I think that's a profound insight. Um, um, the For me, I think that's a profound insight in Marx. What Marx didn't do is the postmodernists, and I'm no great fan of them, as you know,
Mhm.
although I've certainly used them a lot and drawn from them judiciously, carefully, in 35 years as an academic. What they legitimately point out is that reducing everything to the big sociological three classically, gender, race, and class, really is not a refined enough analysis. There are all kinds of other ways to parse the human being and his or her experience. But as far as race, class, and gender go, um, um, I think that in a kind of crude way, and I should get off the topic of Marx pretty soon because, as I say, I'm just a reader of Marx, but I'm not a scholar of Marx, in a crude way did identify some problems. But the left and Marxism, it seems to me, Marxism particularly, are pretty short on answers. I actually see, as I've read Marx more and more over the years, I see him more as poetry than as economics and philosophy.
Wow.
Um, Sociology and psychology too are basically outgrowths of 19th century romantic aesthetics and medicine. Jungian psychology, and as you know, I'm deeply into it. I founded a school of pedagogy called Jungian or archetypal pedagogy. So I love the guy and I love the theory, but the book has yet to be written, although some preliminary steps have been taken in this direction of looking at Jung and Freud and psychoanalysis and archetypal psychology as clinical symbolic expressions of romantic aesthetics, the importance of the heroic individual, dreams, imagery, the realization of the self, the poetic life, the rich um, um, idiosyncratic life narrative. All of these things have been translated into clinical terms over the last 125 or 130 years ago by the great psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysis and Jungian psychology, analytical psychology, are what I consider and call romantic poetry in clinical iteration.
Yeah, and then for those who don't know, psychoanalysis was founded by Freud and analytical psychology by Jung. And you're one of
Right.
those few scholars that I'm aware of that really straddles the line between Jung and Freud quite nicely. You don't
Well,
throw the
thank you.
baby out with the bathwater at all.
I try not to, Ryan. Thank you for noticing that. I mean, I've actually just a half hour before this started was working on a chapter in the new book I'm writing with Rutledge. In this chapter, I'm trying in my own small way as an educational psychologist to unite the best of the most recent, really, it's been going on for some time, but the best of more recent theory and practice in psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory, with Jungian theory, and it's quite possible to do. And how successfully I've done it, only the reader can judge. But I've tried to do it in my work to bring these things together. The
Can you
Freud
tell us
Jung break.
about your book coming up?
Yeah.
Through the one through Rutledge? And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack you.
No, you're fine. Please, I mean, sidetracking me is like double chins having double chins.
That's good.
My, my discourse is a sidetrack. Um,
But you were saying
my
something about Jung and Freud, and I diverted.
right. Well,
But if you could, I know your book addresses it, so maybe you could tell us about your upcoming book and tie in any of those comments
sure,
about Jung and Freud at the same time.
sure. Well, I think that the break between Jung and Freud that occurred around 1912, after a relationship that started in 1905, which, as you know, Ryan, was it was extremely promising. It seemed as if Jung would become the next leader of the psychoanalytic movement after Freud. And that was a pretty heady prospect for, let's see, in 1912, Jung would have been 37. That was a pretty heady prospect for a young psychiatrist, not all that far out of his internship at the Burghausen Clinic in Switzerland. What a prospect, right? But Jung's inclinations were always more towards the transpersonal. That is to say, not only what has happened to us personally and that has registered with us, or that we register in our biographical narratives of ourselves as individuals. Not only that is what matters psychologically. What also matters psychologically are, according to Jung, perennial, maybe even eternal impulses and images, maybe even being beckoned from a higher realm of existence, that also manifests itself in not conscious ways. For Freud, the not conscious way was the personal subconscious, which was the repository of all that was just too painful to remember because of what one had done or what had been done to one most frequently. Um, and just ugly, awful things that we can't keep in our conscious mind. And as Winnicott, the psychiatrist, says, go on being. So we stuff that, and a structure forms, and that's called the subconscious. Uh, Jung said that that's really great when it comes to understanding individual psychodynamics, neuroses, that kind of thing. That it works, but that there's so much more that happens in our dreams and in our art that that is not that is not uh, uh, explicable in terms of our personal experience. I'll give you an example. You've read this example. It's in Jung's book, his 1965 book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. He was a young intern at the Bergholtzy Clinic, and which was a famous clinic, had as its directors illustrious students of Freud and Charcot and um, and it just, you know, it was a great place to be, outside of the fact that psychiatry was seen as a kind of very impoverished, uh, poor cousin science that a real physician wouldn't practice. But within the realms of psychiatry, being at the Bergholtzy was a big thing for Jung. He was making his rounds one day, and he came across a psychotic, schizophrenic patient. We now know that his name was Emil Schifflin, and he was just a villager. He had no particular access to the great literature of the world, and certainly no access to obscure ancient mythologies. Well, Jung listened carefully to his so-called psychotic patients. His mother was a mystic, she was a psychic, she was a medium.
Mm-hmm.
His cousin was. He understood that, well, Emily Dickinson's great line, much madness is divinest sense to the discerning eye, and much sense is starkest madness. And he understood that. And so he listened carefully. And as he listened to Schifflin, Schifflin told him a story about the sun. And the sun was a great huge disk, and it had a kind of a tube hanging down from it. And whenever the wind blew that tube in a certain direction, a world was created, or worlds were created. Well, it was easy to reduce that to a sexual fantasy, right? The dangling tube creation, and also to a power complex fantasy. You know, he has the insight now into how to create worlds. But Jung was a real student of ancient mythologies, and he went back and he found that what Schifflin said corresponded, not point for point, but pretty darn close to certain ancient creation myths. He then began to analyze dreams and psychotic fantasies in those terms, and he found that there was a substratum in many dreams, and some Jungians now would argue in all dreams and fantasies and artistic products, of these images, patterns, motifs, stories, numbers, shapes that have been with us from the very beginning. We're born with them, so they're collective, but they go much more deeply than the subconscious. In fact, for reasons that it's too complex to go into now, we can't really ever directly come into contact with them. Well, the simple reason is they're so powerful, they would blow our psyche to bits. So they are unconscious. We can't access them directly. So that is Jung's collective unconscious. Is any of this making sense?
Yeah, I'm following right along.
Oh, okay. I hope your audience is too. Hope I'm being clear.
I'm just
Well,
so compelled, so I'm just listening.
oh, okay. Thanks, Ryan. Well, I'm feeling like Ronald Reagan here. So, um, Freud didn't like this. He didn't like the idea. Freud very much came out of the 19th century empirical science, naturalist methodology, a frame of mind that the laws of physics could be exported to the operation of nature, where it was pretty successful, but then it could be exported, so others started to conclude, to things like how people feel and operate and how people be and how societies are organized and how they operate and patterns of force and how they can be directed and created or extinguished. And so these new putative sciences like sociology and psychology arise, but they're using the methodology of the physical sciences. There isn't necessarily much correspondence between the algorithms of determining determining how an object falls at 32 feet per second. There's not a lot of correspondence between that and the emotions that come up for me in doing this interview, being interviewed by you. But psychology and sociology, in their more received normative forms now, still want to use those scientific narratives and procedures in endeavors that really have more to do with poetry and art and intuition and more intuitive discourses. Um, and that's why I'm an outlier in the social sciences and in educational research. There was an article done that identified me as an outlier in educational discourse because I don't work by those rules. I don't think that Edward Thorndike was right. In 1902, I think it was, when he announced from Teachers College, Columbia, that which exists in some amount and can be measured. His student added the last bit, but we ascribed the entire quote to Thorndike for reasons of convenience. So check that one out again. That which exists in some amount and can be measured. That doesn't work very well for me when I remember how I felt when I saw my first child emerge from the womb, or when I think about how I feel about the latest poem I've read by the Dominican monk and poet Thomas Merton. It doesn't tell me anything about how I feel about a sunset. It certainly doesn't tell me how I feel about the fact that I'm going to die when I'm sitting on my patio at 3 o'clock in the morning looking up at the stars and smoking a cigarette. There are no equations that cover that. There's no positivist science that even begins to tell me anything that I would benefit, that I can use in an existentially robust way to take those facts and either live in faithlessness or try to find faith. Those equations tell me nothing about that. And how we got off on this one, I don't know. But yeah, there you have that. However we got to that. Oh, I was talking about Jung. You wanted to know the Jung and Freud distinction.
Well,
Is
yeah,
that
but
right?
that was just so beautifully well put, and
Oh, thanks,
it's
Ryan.
just so captivating the way you're drawing this picture of how we feel towards life versus how we try to quantify things and measure them, and that ties right back into the way that we do our schooling systems, as you mentioned
It
earlier.
does.
It's very directly related. But I want to segue here because there's a couple
Sure.
things. One is that you're a prolific writer. I mean, you've written several books. You love writing. I just know you enough to know that you're writing all the time. Is that correct?
Well, we got 12 books out now and 40 refereed articles. So yeah, I like to write. It's my passion.
Yeah,
It
and your
really is.
introduction to Jung book was, I forget the exact title, I haven't read over here, but it was incredibly insightful and it was a great guide
Well,
for me.
I've got it here. I'll hold it up since obviously I'm not above a plug for the book. It's
Plug it away.
let's see, that book. Yeah,
Yeah,
an
Introduction to the
introduction
Collective
to the
Works.
collected works,
Yeah,
and the subtitle is Psyche as Spirit, and it's been pretty well reviewed. And in an article in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which is considered if not one of, if not the premier journal in Jungian psychology. I, along with another Jungian theorist named Murray Stein, was identified as the person who best introduces Jung
yeah, you
in
did a
the
great
most
job.
accessible and accurate. Oh, thanks, Ryan.
Yeah,
It was a labor of love, and yeah, so that book is there too. Um, yeah,
yes. And you're also the founder of Archetypal Pedagogy. And I think that that's something that you did a great job identifying the pathology of the educational system. And I'd like to hear you present your solution. And I think that that comes with the archetypal pedagogical outlook. Is that right?
it's absolutely right, and it's a good question, and it's an impossible one. Um, I always say to my classes that in studying the dynamics of American education, which is what I know about, I'm not a comparative educationist. I don't know a great deal about other systems. I know some, but in looking at any particular issue, my mantra is that every solution to the Gordian knot, the impossible complexity of American education, especially in its historical contexts, every solution will buy you uh, a set of solutions, and it will buy you a set of problems. And the thing is not to find the perfect solution. That doesn't exist. It's not even often to find the best solution. Different solutions will offer different things, and it's a cost benefit analysis, and some will equal out. Sadly, sometimes it's not even to find a good solution. There are problems in American education that are so um, inscribed with general dilemmas that confront us as a nation that they couldn't be solved just in the schools in the first place. Schooling is part of an organically extraordinarily complex interweaving of sites and agendas and agencies and institutions and histories. A school is just a node in that extremely ornate nexus. And so schools can't really by themselves do much to solve anything. They can be places where children are nurtured and places where the complete intellect is encouraged and where holistic knowing with all of oneself is promoted. They can do that. They really can't solve social problems. On the other hand, it is the great American political pastime and shell game to export all of our problems to the schools. Teenage pregnancy, the schools have failed us. Um, Overconsumption of natural resources, the schools didn't teach us not to do that. Um, we don't have a person on Mars yet. Schools haven't produced enough engineers. People are too caught up in the media. Schools aren't compelling enough experiences to draw them away from them. Just whatever problem the American polity faces is immediately translated into a school issue, which of course schools could never solve by themselves. And it sets schools up for failure in ways that don't demonstrate the ineptitude of teachers. Rather, they frustrate the high sense of purpose of teachers so that teachers finally say, look, I am doing 150% beyond what a human being can do. And not only that, I'm spending about $2,000 a year out of pocket to provide for my students in class. This is for poorer
Mm.
schools. And yet society is constantly pointing the finger of blame at me, who's working for much less than you are working for, and feeling it much more deeply. So back to your question. What's the problem? The problem is embedded in the entire evolution, I think, of world history since the Enlightenment. I really take very much a Michel Foucault perspective on this, that with, the advent and the then supremacy of empiricism, rationalism, systematization, corporatization, things that were in any case, in many ways, inevitable, given the sheer thrust and impetus and direction of the way history was going. But it has nevertheless gotten to such a point now that the individual is almost, well, I want to say almost completely erased. That's draconian. But the individual is really under siege. And I think everybody knows that. All of the dystopic um, uh, cinema that we go to see, where um, evil empires and terrible forces and all kinds of mechanized, corporatized, dark, um, systemic agencies consume the individual, are really symbols of what we all sense is going on to us generally, which is being consumed by what now going on probably. I mean, this is a very facile analysis. Things are much more complex than this, but as a thumbnail sketch, has been going on for the last 400 or 500 years. The increasing rationalization, corporatization, depersonalization of the individual and educational processes. So what can be done about this problem? Well, we can turn history around by a half a millennium. Obviously, that's not going to work. And it also happens to be the case that corporatization uh, uh, and the increasing um, 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 mechanization of society has brought with it a variety of blessings. Look at what we're doing right now. Allopathic medicine, which is taken much to task these days for just being a kind of corporate, kind of a stooge for the big pharma. Well, there's something to that, I suppose, but the next time you have a heart attack, you might want to check into your emergency room and have them apply some paddles. We all
And I
take
would just take some
medications.
local herbs for those heart
There
attacks.
you go, Ryan. You see, and let me get all the interviews in with you that I can before that happens. Uh, uh, Please God, that will never happen to you.
Right.
But what I mean is, we all live in and benefit enormously from what this world historical trend has also brought with it.
Mm-hmm.
My analysis is on the, as Jung would say, the shadow side of that. So what's to be done? I'm just in real practical terms, I'm a great fan of site-based governance, which was a very big thing in the 70s. The idea was devolve as much power as you can to the smallest unit that you can. That's usually a school or a district or a cluster of schools. Usually, best off would be a cluster of schools or a school. Let them and the stakeholders, the community involved, and to a certain extent, depending upon their age, even the students involved, in deciding who are we as a school? What does education mean for us? What do we want out of it? What kind of narrative guides our schools? Um, this is, I think, a good way to go. It comes along with a lot of problems. Because you see, in the 1960s, American schooling became more and more centralized under liberal aegis in order to override discriminatory practices, especially in the South and the Southwest.
Oh, I
And
see.
the federal government intervened and things became centralized, starting with Eisenhower's sending of the 101st Airborne into Little Rock to integrate the school. then later with President Kennedy and James Meredith at Ole Miss, uh, Harvey Gantt at, where was he, at Emory, I think, Medical School, Charlene Hunter-Gault, who went on to become a PBS anchor at, I think, University of Georgia. I may be wrong about that. Those were things that we perceived as being necessary. And so schooling became a very centralized affair. But all kinds of problems arose with that, in my view, and we got on a slippery slope that has landed us in a heck of a fix now, that maybe taking power away from centralized modalities and agencies and devolving it more to sites might be a way.
Yeah, your comment about how every solution is going to buy you another set of problems or something along those lines, it
Right.
just fits in so well here. So you're looking at in the 60s, they centralized schools to create a solution for prejudice or systemic issues, and then now schools are so centralized that it's becoming a whole nother oppressive problem instead of issues that is just as complicated. So it's just
Well
like
put. Yeah.
the pendulum swinging from one side to the other. But I love your idea of localizing the school, the politics of the school and the way that the programs are set up. I think that's brilliant.
Thank you, Ryan. Can I say thank you very much? Can I say one more thing about this in a Jungian context?
Sure.
Because I'm very interested in Jungian archetypal analyses of historical patterns. And this swing of the pendulum from centralization to a more atomistic, from a molar to an atomistic approach, from a global to an atomistic approach. That's a trend that one sees historically in the American experience. And the ironic and interesting thing about this now is that in the 60s, it was liberal politics that advocated for more centralized control. Now it's really the conservatives who are advocating for it. You know, the conservative motto when I was growing up was, which is, I think, spuriously ascribed to Jefferson. It's not clear that Jefferson really said this, but that government is best which governs least. That
Mm-hmm.
was the conservative motto in my day and age and in the 60s. Now, uh, conservative programs are every bit as federalized and sweeping and draconian and controlling as liberal programs are, just with a different agenda. And one sees this in the schools. It is the conservatives, mostly conservative policymakers and educationists, who argue for standardized curricula, which in my day in conservatism would have been anathema to the conservative policy of the individual above
Wow.
all. So it's been a very interesting thing to just observe um, historically over the past 40 or 50 years, from the early days of my involvement with the movement in the 60s to a kind of more or less conservative leaning old guy
Mm.
in 2019. As a matter of fact, the more liberal, the more interesting proposals for site-based governance now come from the liberal camp. So the archetypal analysis. Jung had a principle drawn from Heraclitus called enantiodromia. And it means that psychologically, everything turns into its opposite. Stick around long enough and love will turn into hate. Boredom will into interest. Happiness will turn into sadness. Health will turn into illness, and things will just go back and forth that way. The eternal dialectic, one of the only capital T truths I still know. There is a dialectic in things. And if you live long enough, you see it play out in your life. For example, I really want to own a Chrysler now. I'm just joking here, but gosh, when I was a kid, that was an old man's car. But guess what? I'm an old man, you know? I don't want a VW Bug anymore where I can go tooling off to here and there and have high adventures.
Yeah.
I'm too tired to have high adventures. I want a Chrysler. They're very comfortable. Anyway, things will go back and forth in terms will become their opposites, and learning to live in that dialectic and to some extent be part of it, and to in another way detach from it, is an important lesson to learn. And that's uh, essential to what Jung called individuation. One learns to take dialectical opposites and ride with them and blend them, both in terms of external experience coming in and in terms of who you increasingly discover you are. We are each capable of just about everything. We are angels and saints. We are diabolical and heavenly. And somehow coming to realistic terms with that in such a way that we can harness the energy that that tension generates and use it for the good. For me, that's always the main proviso. Use it for the good. The good triumphs here in my
Mm.
narrative. It must, or else, as Kant said, if that's not true, then life is unthinkable. If the suffering of little children is not ultimately made right somehow cosmically by a personal God, then this life is simply unthinkable. It is for me in any case, and that's the way I read Kant. But in any case, moving the dialectic within oneself and outside of oneself towards creative purposes, psychologically creative, socially creative, spiritually robust. That's the ticket.
Wow. That
Yeah.
was so beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Ryan.
Thank you for sharing
I'm
that. That was so fun to hear.
I'm
Um,
glad this is being recorded. I'm going to listen to it at least 5 times every night. I'm going to cut out me.
uh,
I'm just going to have you just respond.
that's perfect. So I want to,
Thanks, Ryan.
I kind of want to, with our last few minutes here, I have some real curiosity, and you're getting really close to it.
Okay.
As a clinical psychologist, as somebody
Which I'm
who,
not. Which I'm not. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, but I was a professor when I got that, and I never did the boards or, never sat for the boards or did
right,
an internship. I've seen people in pastoral settings a lot,
I
but that's
gotcha.
not. So I want to make that
You
clear.
don't want
I
that
don't have.
title conferred upon you.
Well, I don't
You
want
can't
it, and
have it.
it's
Yeah,
yeah, I can't have it, and
yeah.
I think I'm pretty good when I'm working with people in a coaching or a pastoral setting, but
Yes. So let me rephrase
yeah,
it.
okay,
So let's just say, as a doctor of the soul,
well, okay,
and as a doctor of the soul, and as an expert on Jungian psychology and educational psychology, we get a lot of listeners, including myself, who are actively working on sorting themselves out, who
right,
are trying to make the most out of their lives. We got people anywhere from uh, early 20s, late teens, all the way into 30s, 40s, 50s. And these are people who are earnestly seeking the betterment of themselves and others. From your experience, what's the best place to start? As a
gee,
kind of
what
a
a
just
good question.
blow the door wide open here, an open Pandora's box. What do you pick?
Well, this was not a planted question, by the way. I want to make that point clear because I'm going to say you could discuss it with me. I do individual educational consulting, and I do that on a sliding scale. I start at $50 an hour. I'm pretty cheap for a guy with 2 doctorates and 36 years of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you might want to discuss it with me, and you might not.
Where can
And
people go to
that is
find that?
Oh, well, they could call. You could text me at. Um, by the way, let's make this
We'll
clear,
put it in
Ryan.
the
We did.
description. Contact
Oh,
We'll put
okay.
your contact info in the description so people can just find it there.
Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah.
You can call me at my. Well, I don't know if I want to give out my personal
You should
cell.
probably just give out your
I've.
email. Just your email.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
put your
So
email.
you can
Yeah.
post that.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to talk to you about that. I do a lot of that, and to real avail, I think. Aside from me, glorious me, uh, you know, I would say that I'd walk the beach, and You know, you've done a lot of meditating, Ryan. Let some of the chatter go away and don't censor the images that come up as you imagine what would make you really happy. And then, as I always tell my students, vote your conscience. Uh, in a college of education, for example, there are, a disproportionately large number of young women who come in to become teachers. These are very bright and accomplished young women, and they have had to fight a real battle because everybody has told them, well, you're betraying the feminist tradition. You really, what do you think we fought for all these years just so that you can go back to a stereotyped female profession that's underpaid and undervalued? You should be a lawyer. You should be a doctor. You should be a CEO. And I've had any number of young women in my office crying about this because when they really examine themselves, they want to be teachers. And they get to that through prayer. I think prayer is awfully powerful. Meditation, um, real close conversations over a bottle of, you know, um, mind lubricating wine about what really matters to you.
Mm,
Um, looking I hate to sound too new agey because I'm not really. In fact, I'm not at all. But I mean, what is your body telling you when you think, here is me sitting in a lab the first day of med school, or here is me um, collecting stories from villagers in a small Central American area. How do I feel when I envisage myself in both of those venues? And if you feel really good as a narrative collector and not so good as a physician, then even though you might make bazillions of dollars as a physician, it wouldn't have been the route for you to follow.
mm.
I, I, that's such a good question, Ryan. So let me kind of just think about you and address it to you. I would say doing what you're doing, you follow those um, higher impulses that may or may not be calculable as immediately profitable or practical, but you do it because it moves you. And one thing leads to another, and pretty soon it begins to interweave into a tapestry of what I consider to be what I know of you already and what I believe you will do and become in the Jungian world, if that's what you choose to do. You're just that gifted. Is it weaves itself into a tapestry.
Mm.
And I would say, the great Vedic advice, don't push the river. Or rather, I think that actually that may be John Lennon. I don't know, but certainly from Hinduism, you do not need a sword to cut through flowers. Let the process evolve. You're young. Um, you have been raised, and this is one of my constant hues and cries. You have been raised at your age in precisely this kind of corporate educational system that I feel is so damaging. Allow yourself some time to recover from that, and not always to be wondering what the next area of conquest or innovation or sexy new narrative is.
Mm.
Um, Allow yourself to be desolate. Allow yourself to be alone in your choices. Allow yourself to be depressed from time to time. Depression is not a bad thing. Depression is you um, going on that enantiodromaic cycle back and forth. And this is the depression is simply you're sort of unconsciously drawing your energy in, letting it rest, letting it be quiescent. And to the active conscious mind, that looks like something bad. But if you let yourself just be in it, it will probably fructify in something pretty wonderful. Many artists relate that before their really most creative surges, they go through periods of depression. Um, uh, Depression is productive. You don't want too much of it, and you certainly don't want it to become suicidal. But I'd say allow yourself the full gamut of emotions and do what I do whenever I sit down to write a book, which is try to forget everything I've learned.
Mm.
Because I mean, that's overstated. It's hyperbole to make a point, but to be creative is to risk making mistakes. We're not allowed to do that. To be creative is to look foolish sometimes. We're not allowed to do that. To be creative is to risk an existential failure. That's horrible, terrible, awful. Well, none of those things are true. It's not horrible, terrible, awful, and we should be allowed to do those things. Let yourself go through a range of emotions. Realize that in deciding where you really want to go, there's a certain kind of healing involved too. And I'd say stick with the imagery. When you think it, just put yourself in different positions. Imagine yourself in an operating room, standing before a judge arguing a case, selling a piece of real estate, at home taking care of a baby, um, training for the next athletic event. Picture yourself doing those things, and then just how do you freaking feel about that? What comes up for you? What is the feeling tone? What is the affective uh, uh, accretion of emotions and images in you? And those that are most pleasurable and energizing are probably the way you might want to start moving.
Wow. That is so nice. I mean, everything you just said are all things that I've been working on for myself. And I don't know if other people believe in synchronicity, but I certainly have had too many
Yeah,
experiences of synchronicity. And
yeah.
what you just said to me, in many ways, was realizations I had just come to for myself today. Like
Wow.
I went into the mountains and I climbed to the top of a hill and I sat by the rocks and I sat in prayer and meditation, and it told me to follow that creative force, to trust it, to let go, and to hear you reinforce those experiences for me, whether it's a mere coincidence or whether it's a divinely ordained happening. I'm incredibly touched by what you just shared with me, and I hope other people are as well.
Thank you, Ryan. It is a blessing to be of service to you. You are the real deal in a spiritual and ethical sense, and it is just a real privilege to talk to you today and to your audience. Thank you very much, and do forgive me in retrospect for um, my to say I have a tendency to ramble is like saying I don't know what the stock exchange has a tendency to seek profit. Yeah.
Well, you're in good
So
company
anyway,
because the whole reason I do podcasting is, well, not the whole reason, that's an overstatement, but a good part of the reason I do podcasting is because I don't mind rambling much myself. So you're in
well,
good
great,
company here,
Ryan.
and
Well,
I hope you can come on to the show many times over and over again
would
if you'll
love
take
to.
us up on it. And I have a feeling our listeners might grow a liking to having you on, and might actually
Thanks.
have
I
some
would love
questions
that.
for you. Yeah.
Well, that'd be great, Ryan. And we'll be in contact personally too. I'm going to want to keep track of you.
Yeah.
Okay, Ryan. Well, thank you. And thank you all for listening, however many or whoever you are. And I'm touched by your interest. And I hope something I've said has touched you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mays. I'll
Thank
talk to you soon.
you, Ryan. Great talking to you, my brother. Till
You as
later.
well. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Hi, folks. Thank you for tuning in to Sorting Myself Out in this episode with Dr. Clifford Mays. I hope that you enjoyed it, and there'll be more episodes to come. So stay tuned, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell, and we'll continue to provide content.